Hello, my name is Shagun Saklani Pandey and I am a faculty at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. The title of today's module is Rights of Children who are Displaced in Armed Conflict. This particular module comes under the subject Criminology and the paper's name is Juvenile Justice. This particular module is divided into 4 sections. The first section will give you a brief introduction of what displacement is during situations of armed conflict. The second section will bring out how children get affected in situations of armed conflict. The next section will bring out what are some of the legal measures in India and internationally available for children who are affected in situations of armed conflict. And then we will be wrapping up the module with some concluding thoughts. Overall, the objectives of this particular module are to get an understanding of the phenomena of displacement in situations of armed conflict and how it impacts children. The other objective is to bring about what are some of the legal measures available for the protection of rights of children in situations of displacement during armed conflict. Let us begin with section 1. As we all know that armed conflict can be international or intrastate in nature. Armed conflict are primarily two in nature. Broadly, they can be divided into international armed conflict and intrastate armed conflict. International armed conflict basically is between two states. It could be two international parties also. On the other hand, the intrastate armed conflict usually is between parties that could be one government and one non-government actors. However, in today's time, if we look across, we see that across the globe there is more prevalence of intrastate armed conflict. Intrastate armed conflict also leads to many kind of other effects. Displacement is one of the major byproducts of armed conflict that are intrastate in nature. So as I said, that majority of armed conflict in today's time is of intrastate in nature. There is also displacement in situations of armed conflict that are intrastate in nature. The intrastate armed conflict are usually characterized by large-scale elimination or incapacitation of civilians through killings, tortures and disappearance. One also sees that during situations of intrastate armed conflict, there is also destruction of social institutions. People who are affected by these conflicts often live in continued sense of fear, uncertainty and insecurity. Forced migration and displacement also come out as one of the major characteristics of intrastate armed conflict. Displacement has the following characteristics. It leads to a destroyed livelihood, there is economic insecurity, there is lack of basic necessities for survival and development, and this leads to increased vulnerability, especially amongst women and children. Displacement often leads to lost homelands, fractured households and communities. Displacement also leads to destruction of a common social bond and shared value of humanity. Now, it is also important for us to look at what basically displacement is and what are the various forms of displacement. Displacements are of two types. One, that is across international borders, and people affected by this particular kind of displacement are called refugees. The other kind of displacement is internal in nature, and people affected by this internal displacement are called internally displaced person or the IDPs. Now let us see what refugee means. The World's Refugee Protection System was established with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, also known as UNHCR, in 1950. And the United Conventions relating to status of refugees, also known as the Refugee Convention of 1951, was then adopted. According to this particular convention, the definition of refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion. Also, it's important here to bring out some global figures. According to the UNHCR, the global trends of 2015, there are around 65.3 million people across the globe who are refugees. This would also mean that around 1 person in every 113 persons is displaced from their homes by conflict or persecution. We shall now look into the definition of internally displaced persons. The guiding principles on the internally displaced GPID states that the internally displaced persons are persons or groups of persons who have been forced or are obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effect of armed conflict situations of generalized violence, violation of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an international border. Here, I would also like to highlight, when we talk of refugees and internally displaced persons in situations of armed conflict, it's also important to understand that the internally displaced persons are more vulnerable. The reasons for this are many. One, because internationally we do not have many legal safeguards available for people who are internally displaced. Also, it is important to understand that as the internally displaced persons remain in their own country of origin, this would also mean that many a times when displacement happens, it is also because of any kind of conflict that these people have with their own government. In such situations, they continue to be under the rule and the laws of the same government. So this actually leads to a more vulnerable situation for them. Around the world today, across more than 50 countries, there are estimated of 27.1 million IDPs as a result of armed conflict. Also, according to the World Disaster Report of 2012, there were approximately 28 million internally displaced persons, most of them a result of non-international armed conflict. Now, we shall be looking at the other section of this particular module. We will be looking at the displaced children and we will give you a brief overview of what these children go through. Basically, children are the worst affected when families are displaced from their lands and homes. These particular children live with continuous sense of insecurity, anxiety and uncertainty. Refugees are relatively in a better state than that of the internally displaced persons, including children. This is due to the availability of formal guarantees or protections given to refugees. No such specific provisions have been provided to the IDPs. Also, it's important for us to highlight that amongst the population of refugees and the internally displaced persons, children and women comprise of the maximum numbers. This brings out the vulnerability that children face during situations of armed conflict and displacement. Let me now highlight some of the vulnerabilities that children face during displacement. There is vulnerability of children in flight. This would mean that to flee from one's home involves a deep sense of loss and uncertainty. Families and children flee from their home because they are in danger of being killed, tortured or forcibly recruited, raped, abducted or even starved to death. They often leave behind their belongings, which are familiar surroundings and established social relations and networks. People, also including children, are vulnerable to attacks and other physical harms during situations of displacement. Limited or no food, shelter or water for survival is present for these children. These children become acutely undernourished and prone to illness, and they are the first ones to die in situations of displacement. Children especially girls in situations of flight, are even more vulnerable to sexual abuse. The other category of children during situations of displacement and armed conflict are the unaccompanied children. These are the ones who are separated from their parents and are not in the care of any other adult who by law or custom has taken responsibility to do so. These particular unaccompanied children are vulnerable and at risk of neglect, violence, military recruitment, sexual assault and other kind of abuses. Unaccompanied children are often institutionalized and their emotional and development needs are also often neglected. One also sees that many a times due to lack of any identity proof, these unaccompanied children often continue to stay in institutionalized settings. Evacuation is also an important part of displacement. Families living in conflict areas often evacuate these areas out of security concerns and fear. Many a times, children are sent to distant places and relatives residing in other safer places. This evacuation has some long-term effects like trauma arising of family separation. There is also an increased risk of trafficking during these situations. Sending children to far-off places also leads to breaking up of family ties and often leads to developmental challenges in a child. One also sees an existence of camps in situations of armed conflict. Camps usually emerge as byproducts of conflict. Particularly, many studies have brought out how in situations of camps there are scarce resources for survival and development. There is vulnerability to abuse and other forms of exploitation. While living in camps, children also witness violence against one's own families and community members. There is also a continued sense of identity crisis that many children face. So far we've covered what armed conflict means, what are some of the effects of armed conflict and displacement being one of them. We've also looked at how displacement leads to an impact on children. We have also looked at what different kind of displacement means and how different kind of people are categorized under international armed conflict and intrastate armed conflict. We have also looked at many vulnerabilities that children face during situations of displacement in armed conflict. We shall now be looking at the section on rights of displaced children. This particular section we will be looking at the rights of displaced children. The UNCRC, that is the United Convention on the Rights of the Child, has laid down many rights for children. These also include the displaced children. The UNCRC Article 2 talks about non-discrimination. It says that discrimination of any kind, irrespective of the child, of his or her parents or legal guardian's race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national, ethnic or social origin, property, disability, birth or other status should not be discriminated. The state has to take all appropriate measures to ensure that child is protected against all forms of discrimination or punishment on the basis of the status, activities, expressed opinions or beliefs of the child's parents, legal guardian or family members. Therefore, discrimination of any kind should neither be practiced nor be tolerated by the state. This equally applies to the displaced children also. UNCRC then also talks about the best interest of the child. Especially in situations of armed conflict, all measures and initiatives undertaken for the protection of children must be aimed at ensuring the physical, mental and social well-being of children. The best interest of the child should be the priority of all policy makers and implementers. Also, it's important for us to understand that children who are orphaned, separated or unaccompanied are most vulnerable in situations of displacement also. it becomes very important to ensure the care and protection of these children. The term best interest was transformed from being a legal norm to a principle by the UNCRC. This particular principle of best interest of child requires the state to systematically consider how children's rights and their interests might be affected by their decisions and actions, which must be based on the child's best interest, one of the core 4 principles of the UNCRC. The UNCRC further talks about participation of every child. This also includes the displaced children. Nations who have ratified the UNCRC have advocated for the rights of children, and they should be engaged in the process of decision making and protection. It is also advocated that children should be empowered as right holders with entitlements, including the right to have a say and to be heard in decisions that affect their lives. Even children who are displaced by armed conflict are to be included in decision making. Article 12 of the UNCRC states that children have the right to participate in decision making processes that may be relevant in their lives and to influence decisions taken in their regard within the family, the school or the community. The guiding principles for the internally displaced persons, principle number 18 and 28, have stated that in the planning and distribution of humanitarian assistance and in planning internally displaced persons' return or resettlement and reintegration, special efforts should be made to ensure the full participation of internally displaced persons, including children. This would also include both boys and girls. UNCRC also lays down a very important right to every child. This is the right to life, dignity and physical, mental and moral integrity. These include protection from physical attack, violence and abuse, access to life-sustaining assistance. These would include food, potable water, basic shelter, housing, appropriate clothing and essential medical services and sanitation facilities. This also includes psychosocial support for every child. It includes education and respect for cultural identity, language and religion. Also, return or settlement in safety and ensuring that children have the voice in decisions that affect their lives. Article 7 of the United Nations Convention on Right of Child states that every child has the inherent right to life and the state has an obligation to ensure to the maximum extent possible the survival and development of every child. The right to adequate standard of living, both during armed conflict and otherwise. The basic requirement for adequate standard of living, that is, food, clothing and shelter, are drastically affected during situations of armed conflict. Article 27 of the UNCRC states that the state party shall also provide in times of need material assistance and support programs, particularly with regards to nutrition, clothing and housing. Article 24 puts an obligation on the state to ensure rights of the child to enjoy the highest attainable standard of health. It is the responsibility of the state to ensure the availability and accessibility of basic amenities along with healthcare services with special attention to expecting mothers, children, survivors of gender and sexual violence, people affected by HIV/AIDS and other such ailments. Right to physical security and the provision of safe place. In situations of armed conflict, children need spaces that are safe for them in terms of threat and other physical harm. Children need safe places like the child-friendly spaces, hospital and safety zones, neutralized zones and humanitarian corridors. An explanation of these are given in the module. Internally displaced children are to be recruited permanently in part of hostilities. During situations of armed conflict, children are vulnerable to recruitment. Children in refugees and displacement camps are more likely to be the soft targets of the combatants. Recruiting or using children under the age of 18 as soldiers or allowing them to participate in hostilities is expressly prohibited by the UNCRC and the Additional Protocol to the Geneva Convention, Article 77 and 4. Now we shall be looking at the right to protection from all forms of sexual and gender-based violence. Vulnerability of children during sexual violence is prevalent in situations of armed conflict and displacement. Girls continue to be more vulnerable to rape, trafficking, mutilation, etc. Article 3, 34, 35 and 37 of URC states that children must enjoy protection from torture, cruel, inhuman treatment and also encompassing rape and other acts of sexual violence. Right to documentation. This right is usually considered as secondary, especially in situations of armed conflict. It is vital as it brings out the situational analysis of children in these conflict zones and displacement camps. In situations of armed conflict, children often go missing or are invisible due to lack of any kind of identification proof. There is lack of documentation and this leads to other problems like that of enrollment in school, missing out on immunization, inaccessibility to various services and also claiming of various other rights. Article 7 and 8 reaffirms the right of all children to be registered immediately after birth and the right from birth to a name and requires states to undertake respect the right of child to preserve his or her identity including nationality, name and family relations as recognized by law. Right to education. Education also gets affected in situations of armed conflict. There is infrastructural devastation. Displacement often leads to disruption in education. UDHCR Article 28 of the CRC affirms the right to free and compulsory education at the primary level to all children. International humanitarian law affirms the right to education in times of armed conflict, including occupation and in the event of evacuation. The right of the internally displaced persons to education, including vocational training, whether they are in camps or not, is essential. Education must respect internally displaced persons' cultural identity, language and religion and the full and equal participation of women and girls. This has been laid down on the general principles of IDPs. Children also have the right to psychological support and reintegration programs. Armed conflict have deep psychological impact on children. It not only affects children directly, but has a long-term impact that affects their overall development. The orphans, street-connected children, child soldiers, trafficked children and displaced children are most vulnerable to psychological effects. Article 39 of the UNCRC obliges state parties to promote the physical and psychological recovery and social reintegration of child victim of neglect, exploitation or abuse, torture or any other form of cruel, inhuman or degrading form of punishment or of armed conflict. Such recovery and reintegration shall take place in an environment which fosters the health, peer respect and dignity of every child. The right to freedom of religion, belief and participate in cultural and community life. Displaced children are often discriminated on the basis of their cultural and religious orientations and practices. Though they have the right to freely participate in religious and cultural activities, but often their right is not protected. Article 31 of the CRC recognizes the right of the child to rest and leisure and to engage in play and recreational activities appropriate to the child's age and to participate freely in cultural life and art. Article 20 makes the state liable to provide special protection for a child deprived of family environment, paying due respect to child's cultural background. Children in displaced situation also have the right to freedom of movement, including for and within camps. During displacement, the freedom of movement is directly affected. It not only affects children's ability to attend school, their right to play safely, but directly hampers their development also. Restriction to stay within a specified area also makes children more vulnerable in terms of chances of them being abused and exploited, or even more, as they are within easy access of the exploiters. Like other persons, displaced children too have the right to move freely in and out of camps or other settlements. So students, in this particular module, we have so far looked at what armed conflict is and what are the various impacts of armed conflict on different people. Displacement being one of the major byproducts of armed conflict has been discussed in detail. Displacement of internally displaced persons and refugees has also been looked at. However, our major focus so far has been on children who get displaced in situations of armed conflict. We have also laid down the rights that are available to these children nationally and internationally. We shall now be wrapping up this session and bring out some of the afterthoughts. Children who are displaced internationally or nationally are vulnerable, and they continue to be vulnerable till the time armed conflict ceases to exist. Despite of the guarantees that are available for these children for their protection and development nationally or internationally, we still see that millions of children across the globe continue to live in a life that is full of uncertainty, fear and insecurity. Children in situations of displacement and armed conflict often are left hungry, malnourished or with no or limited access to healthcare facilities, education and other basic amenities for survival and development. All these lead to children's vulnerability. Children also who are rehabilitated in newer areas often face the challenges of reintegration. Especially in situations of displacement, reintegration and resettlement comes out as a major challenge. There are problems of identity of these children. Also, in case they get admitted to new schools, there is a problem during admission procedures and acceptance of transfer certificates also. This especially stands true for families who resettle in the neighboring countries or areas or states. One also sees that many a times children are born during the time of displacement. For those who are born in displacement camps, there is more vulnerability attached to them. The camp life remains to be the only reality that they have seen. They have not seen any life outside the camps. Displacement can also lead to many forms of violation of children's right in relation to their access to different services like that of nutrition, education, health and other facilities that are of prime importance for child's development in all spheres. Displacement also leads to other kind of child vulnerabilities, and this often directly leads to issues like that of child labor, child trafficking, child marriages and other forms of all kind. So, in this particular module, we hope that you get an understanding of what situation children go through, what are the various vulnerabilities that children face during situations of armed conflict and specifically during the situations of displacement camps. However, children in displacement camps and that arise out of armed conflict have been an under-researched area. it becomes important for us to look at this particular area and bring out what are some of the vulnerabilities that children face. For all of us, it is an important area of concern, as in India, also children who are affected by the internal displacement often live a life of vulnerability. What happens to these children because they continue to stay in camps? What is the kind of life they aspire for? What are some of the dreams that they have? What is the government doing for these particular children? And how the basic services are affected for these children? There are many questions like these that exist in our mind. This particular module has given you an understanding of what the situation of children in such areas is and what are some of the rights are available for these children. For us, it is very important to understand that these children need to be protected, and only then we can help them. We can also prevent other vulnerabilities that children face, like that of child labor, trafficking, marriage, abuse, etc. For more details on different sections, laws and procedures on children who are displaced by situations of armed conflict can be referred to in the module. I strongly recommend that you go through all the module and see what are some of the details in this front. Thank you.